Hello, Synapse community. My name is Ryan Magitimer. I'm a product manager on the Azure Synapse Analytics team. And today is another episode of the Azure Synapse MVP video series. For those of you unfamiliar, each month I'm joined by an MVP and we talk about something I'm interested in. This month I'm joined by Kevin Chant. We're going to be talking about a complete CI/CD experience for Synapse Link for SQL. If you're unfamiliar with Synapse Link for SQL, we actually did a whole video talking about it on this very channel. You can find a link in the description for this video. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Kevin. Welcome.
Thanks, Ryan. And for the benefit of those I've yet to meet, my name is Kevin Chant, and I'm a Microsoft MVP living in the Netherlands. However, as some of you can probably tell from the accent, I'm actually originally from the southwest of the UK. Now, setting up Azure Synapse Link for SQL Server 2022 can be a relatively easy experience as long as you follow the online guides from Microsoft. However, if you want to make database changes afterwards, for example, if you want to change a column in a table, it can be a bit of a tedious process. And I can show you now why it can be tedious, along with one way that you can improve the experience by using CI/CD in Azure DevOps. As you can see, I've already got Azure Synapse Link for SQL Server 2022 configured and running in Synapse Studio. And you can tell that it's running because there is a stop button here. If the link had been stopped, it would be replaced by a start button instead. Now, this particular link collects data from two tables that are in a SQL Server 2022 database, which I can show you here in Azure Data Studio. And if we scroll down towards the bottom of the configuration here on the screen, you can see that the destination target pool is a dedicated SQL pool, which I can show you in the Data Hub in Synapse Studio. And in addition to that, you will see that I've configured it to drop and recreate the tables in the dedicated SQL pool every time the link is restarted. And this is the easiest setting to use if you're intending to change the schema of tables in Azure Synapse Link for SQL Server 2022. However, if I do, for example, want to add a new column to either of these tables, I first have to click on the stop button here in Synapse Studio, patiently wait for the link to stop, and then go to my SQL Server management tool of choice, make a column change to either of those tables there, and you then have to go back into Synapse Studio and click on the start button and then wait for the link to start again. As you can imagine, that can become very tedious, especially if you want to do a lot of column changes or you're dealing with a lot of tables, which is why I figured out a way to make the experience a lot easier by using Azure DevOps. And in order to do that, I had to first create a database project based on the database. So for example, here in Azure Data Studio, I've created a database project based on the wide world importers database. And a database project you can essentially think of as your database schema in code form. Now, once I created a database project, I could actually synchronize it with a Git repository in Azure repos, which basically means that every time I make a column change, if we go back in here to one of these tables, for example in order lines, I can then synchronize that change with this Git repository, which can then be used as a pipeline in Azure DevOps. And to quickly show what I mean, there's actually two different pipeline experiences that you can use in Azure DevOps for this. The first one is by using what's known as the classic editor, which is a GUI-based method, along with the releases feature, which is also GUI-based, and the other is by working with YAML pipelines. So, first of all, I'll show you how to do the classic editor. So, you can use the classic editor by clicking on the pipeline and then selecting use the classic editor option. Then you can use the GUI-based format like this. And as you can see here, I'm basically creating what's known as a DATPack file based on the contents of the database project. So once that's done, I can then publish it as part of an artifact into Azure DevOps. From there, I can use the releases feature to do the actual deployment. So if I click on edit on here, you can see first of all I specify which artifact to use, which in our case would be the one that we created in the classic editor, which contains the DATPack file. And then from there, we can select various tasks to be performed to do the deployment. So here, I'm actually stopping the link by using a PowerShell command, as you can see here. And then polling the status of it basically every 20 seconds until it's stopped. And I can zoom in a bit to show you that. From there, I download the build artifact, which contains the DATPack that was created in the classic editor. Then use the contents of that DATPack to deploy the updates to the SQL Server database. And then use another PowerShell commandlet to start the link again, as you can see here. Now, I did say that you can also do this by using a YAML pipeline as well in Azure DevOps, and I'll show you how that looks now. And for some of you, that might be your only option anyway, because recently Microsoft introduced the ability to disable using the classic editor. So if I click on edit on here and remove the assistant, this is basically a text-based version of what you just saw in the classic editor and the release feature. So first, this YAML file is actually creating the DATPack, as you can see here, and then publishing the artifact that contains the DATPack back in Azure DevOps. Is then stopping the link using exactly the same PowerShell that you saw just now in the releases feature. Is then deploying the DATPack, and then, as you may have already guessed, it uses another PowerShell commandlet to start the link again. And that is how you can have a complete CI/CD experience for Azure Synapse Link for SQL Server 2022 using Azure DevOps, Ryan.
Can we see it in action?
Sure. I've got everything set up already because I had a feeling you were going to ask me that. So, say for example that I want to update the sales.orders table that I use as part of my Azure Synapse Link for SQL Server 2022 setup. Well, what I can do is first of all go over to Azure Data Studio, go to Database Projects, and then drill down to the SQL file that relates to the schema of the table. And then from there, I can just add a new column like so. I'm just going to save it. And then I'm going to go into Source Control, which is automatically recognized as a change to that file. I'm just going to say that I've added a column here. And then I'm going to commit the change, which basically hardens the change to my local Git repository. Azure Data Studio then kindly invites me to synchronize my changes with the repository that I have in Azure DevOps. So if I go over now to Azure DevOps and I hit on refresh in the Git repository, you can see it says that the sales folder has had a recent update. If I drill down into there and scroll down, you can see that the orders.sql table has just been updated. Now, if we go over to pipelines, you can see that the YAML pipeline is currently running. So if I open it up and edit it, and I get rid of the assistant, you can see that the trigger is based on the main branch, and that's why it's automatically running now. So if we go back over, and I click on the YAML pipeline running and scroll down, you can see that it's already finished the build SQL DATPack stage and is now in the process of stopping the link running. And then from there, it will carry on to do the rest of the pipeline. Now, I suggest that we pause the video here, Ryan, and then return once the pipeline is completed so I can show all of you how it looks once it's finished. So, we're back, and as you can see, the pipeline is now completed. If we go over to Azure Data Studio and we go down now and look at the table, and I just do a refresh, we look at the columns, we can see that the new column is there. In addition to that, what we can actually do is go back in the Synapse Studio, go to the dedicated SQL pool, do a refresh on the columns for this particular table, and as you can see quite clearly, the new column is there as well. So that is the YAML pipeline in action, Ryan.
That's pretty cool. Since we've done a couple of videos together already now, I suspect we can do the same thing in GitHub.
You're absolutely right there, Ryan. And I can actually show you how it looks in GitHub now. So, if we go over to GitHub, you can see a repository that looks very similar to the one that I showed you earlier in Azure DevOps. Now, if I click on the Actions tab, you can see that I recently ran a workflow. And if I click on that workflow and scroll down and then zoom in here, you can see this particular workflow does the same as what I showed you just now in Azure DevOps. So first of all, it creates a DATPack, then it stops the link, then it deploys the created DATPack to the SQL Server database, and then it starts the link again. Now, this particular workflow can be found in the code in the .github/workflows subfolder. And if I click on this particular YAML file, you can see that just like YAML pipelines in Azure DevOps, it has its own YAML schema as well. And this YAML file is what's used for that workflow. So that, Ryan, is how you can do the same thing in GitHub.
Well, that wraps up our video for today. Thanks, Kevin, for joining us and talking about Synapse Link for SQL and CI/CD. Tell us in the comments, do you like CI/CD? Do you like Synapse Link for SQL? I would love to hear about it. Again, my name is Ryan Magitimer. You can find me on Twitter. You can find Azure Synapse on Twitter, Azure_Synapse. You can also find Kevin on Twitter, Kev Chant. Now, the real question is if you like Twitter, if you like social media, Twitter, LinkedIn, MySpace, I'm sure there's more social media places that you can be. And if you do know those, you might just think to yourself, now, isn't there a program I could join? Yes, there is a program, the Azure Synapse Influencer Program. It is very exciting. It is very cool. If you're thinking, do cool people do this? Yes, all the cool people are doing this. The cool kids. That's really what we want to be. We all really want to be the cool kids. And to get one step closer, the Azure Synapse Influencer Program. It's very quick, very easy. Click the link in the description of this video. couple clicks away, and you're in. And with that said, like, comment, subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.